Hello and welcome to the ReConnect podcast, a weekly show sponsored by the Anasazi Foundation and powered by Sturry Studios. I'm Ganel-Lyn Condie, your host. I'm so grateful you've joined us, where we have conversations to help you strengthen your most important relationships and reconnect with those that matter most. Hello, I'm Ganel-Lyn Condie, and this is the ReConnect podcast. We are coming to you from the Sturry Studios, and we are grateful for the Anasazi Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. This is one of my solo messages, and I'm grateful for episodes where I can just bring a few nuggets to share thoughts and things that are weighing on my mind and heart. I love it when we have guests here that we get to have these really complex conversations and get to all the different layers of different experiences from community leaders, health professionals, and the personal stories that we value bringing to you here at the ReConnect podcast. But every once in a while, I love to just share a message, a quick listen episode, so to speak, so that you can, we like to sit down for a nice 5-course meal, but sometimes you just need the drive-through. So this is your drive-through episode. I want to share with you my thoughts on values. And at the time of this taping, it's the first of the year, and we are ending with the holiday season and starting to think about a new year. The new year is 2020, and that seems significant. I don't know if you're a number person, but it seems significant. And I love to talk about goals and progression and moving forward in my life, but I'm not a super big fan of New Year's resolutions. Why? Well, for me, New Year's resolutions are very much one of those, like, did we do it? Did we not do it? And sometimes it's so ambiguous, like you want to be healthy. That's your New Year's resolution, for example. What does healthy look like? Is it a number on the scale? Is it your blood pressure? Is it your cholesterol? Is it sleeping more? Is it a health condition that you're trying to address? Maybe you have a New Year's resolution of being more successful at work. Oftentimes with New Year's resolutions, they're too broad and they're hard to measure and they're not actionable steps. And they also can start to feel like either yes or a no. You did it, you didn't do it. You won, you lost. I am a bigger fan of planning your new year with values in mind. I like to describe values like a compass. They're not a destination on the map. They're a director to help you know, are you moving in the right direction? But there are a million different values out there. There are lists all over Pinterest. You can Google them. There's blog posts about values, and they're an extensive list. And so why is a value-driven new year a more effective approach to progression than maybe a New Year's resolution? Well, like I shared with the example of health, sometimes our New Year's resolutions are too general, and values are not so specific. So it's kind of that sweet spot in the middle. A value allows you to have measurable steps that change with your life. For example, it's January, you're making your New Year's resolutions, your life looks a certain way. You have this job, your family dynamics are in line with the goal you just set. But by May, something's changed. You've lost your job, or there's a health issue with a member of your family, or you've had to move and you didn't plan on that. And all of a sudden, this New Year's resolution you made in January doesn't fit with what's happening in your life at the time. Values can grow with you. So if your value is, for example, from my last year that we're just finishing, one of my values was faith. Faith to me is so big of a concept that would be maybe overwhelming to consider for your value. But I do value faith. What can I do to foster that value? So what I will do is then look for, on a month-to-month basis, what can I do to foster that value? Use that value of faith as a compass to head me in a direction. So maybe for the month of May, to foster more or encourage more faith in my life, maybe it's including a practice that I had let go. Maybe it's more meditation time. But then by the time November hits, I've worked better in the meditation area of my life, but I've let another part of my faith drop. One of the opposites of faith is fear. So that's why I've loved having this value this year is that each time I find myself trapped in that fear, whether it's around being a mom, whether it's around my health, whether it's around my professional career, the opposite practice for fear is gratitude, and that returns me to faith. So that's just one example in where I've used that value this year. My other value, so I choose two, that's my next tip for you, is that once you decide that maybe values are better and work better with your life than a New Year's resolution, and you go to Pinterest and you print a list of values off, my suggestion is you don't choose just one. It boxes you in. If faith had been my only focus this year, I would have been frustrated. And I think it's important to note that don't go into judgment about what you think it's going to look like by the end of the year. I'd love to title this episode, Begin with the End in Mind. So if you start with the end in mind, how do you want to feel a year from now? I can tell you my second value I chose for 2019 was influence. Now at first, this is one of my tips in choosing values is you just start getting curious. You start looking at those lists on Pinterest or on Google. You start reading through them. Here's some of, I've printed off one because there's so many values. Belonging, calmness, challenge, cheerfulness, community, goodness, grace, growth, happiness, joy, leadership, love, loyalty, obedience, success, strength, spontaneity, service, self-reliance, self-control, uniqueness, unity, usefulness, vision, vitality. That's a quick, from A to Z, there are so many lists out there. And so first thing I would suggest to you in choose at least two values. That helps you not get boxed into just one way of thinking. It's more expansive, but it's not so expansive that you're kind of lost in the weeds of like, well, I'm not growing, I'm not progressing, I'm not changing this year. So my second word was influence. The way I got curious about that is I went through some of these value lists and I circled my top 10. What words just like stood out? What I noticed, what felt like they were resonating with my spirit. And then I narrowed it to 5. Then I sat with the 5 for a couple weeks. And I tried to narrow it down to my top 3. And I did not like that the word influence kept showing up. I actually rejected that word. I did not want that for my 2019 value word. I didn't want it. In my mind, that word influence had to do with like followers on Instagram or on YouTube. And I didn't feel like that was in line with my why, my mission, and what I'm doing in speaking and media and in writing. For me, it's more important to identify the one. And to help with connection, I didn't want to be so hyper-focused on influence. And then I had a conversation with a friend because I kept wrestling with it. I kept going through those lists and it still always spoke to me. And I was talking to a friend of mine and she knew some of my parenting goals. I have a son that's in college and he was coming home from serving for 2 years in Africa. And I was anxious about what our new relationship would look like. We're not in the same dependent child at home relationship. And how do I parent what I call a baby adult affectionately? And I was talking to this friend. I don't like this word. It feels like it's one of the value words that keeps coming up for this next year. What should I do? And she helped me reframe it. She said, but this is exactly in line with what you're trying to do as a parent, because I can't control. A 22-year-old kid is very different. The influence I have on him is different than the influence I had when he was 6 or 10 or 12 living in my home full time. And I was in charge of making sure he was at school and he got to the doctors and he got his homework done and he got enough sleep and I bought the food that he ate. That's changed. My relationship with him as a parent has changed. It's evolved. We are now trying to develop an adult relationship, and that's very different. And she helped me reframe the word influence. And in the work I do with suicide prevention, I often talk about loving someone that struggles with depression and anxiety, and that we can't save anyone. We can invite, we can influence, we can inspire. Invite, influence, and inspire. And all of a sudden this word, this value word of influence, felt so much more expansive. And it was super helpful. Now I'm at the end of 2019 and I'm looking back. There were some months I don't think I moved towards my values as much as I like. I didn't develop a better, more consistent, in my mind, meditation practice. And I really wanted that to be my goal this year. It was one way in which I was going to foster faith in my life. But I can also see other practices, other ways in which I fostered faith. I turned away from fear. I went to trust. I surrendered how I thought things were going to look all the time. And that, to me, at the end of this year, was a value that helped me move towards faith. The faith in my life has increased this year. Influence. Now, I do have more followers on Instagram and YouTube and Twitter, and ironically, that wasn't really what I wanted. I wanted my message to influence a greater number of people. This podcast launched this year, and it has been shared. That influence has been helped. But I also see where it has helped, that value has helped me get out of some sticky situations as a parent and professionally. There was a time this year where there was a flood of suicides in the area I lived in, and I was being contacted about them, and it put me into a headspace of like, am I really making a difference in the work that I'm doing? As my messages, my podcast, my YouTube channel, all those things being felt, and are they reaching the people that I really want to reach? And then I had to return back to that compass of influence. And I returned to my why. And I returned to messages I've gotten from individuals on Instagram and on social media and different platforms that have thanked me for that. And it reminded me, this word influence is expansive. It's not about numbers. It's not about book sales. It's not about any of that. It's about, am I inviting? Am I inspiring in the things I'm trying to create as a person that wants to help make the world a more connective, healing place? Have I influenced that in the posts that I've done, the work that I've done, the talks that I've given? Yes, I can say yes at the end of 2019. Is it always measurable? No. And then this word influence has helped me out of some really sticky parenting situations. I want to take the wheel back. I want to control the decisions my kids make, because that takes away my vulnerability. And it helps me feel like somehow my kids are safe and they're progressing and they're going to be happy and healthy. And I have to keep returning. I have chosen to keep returning to the word influence, especially in conversations where I want to solve the problem. My kids come to me with an issue, and if they're listening to this, they may say I haven't done great at it. I haven't been perfect at this, but I've tried to remember in certain conversations where I wanted to hurry and jump in with a solution, my value word pulled me out of that snag of control, pulled me out of that, let me give you advice, and I returned to it. It was my compass that helped me, just like when you're out in the wilderness and you're trying to make sure you arrive where you need to on the map and you don't have GPS, a compass is still one of those tools that help you go north or see what direction you're heading. Your values can help you do that. So one of the invitations I would have for you today, as you look at this new year that's approaching, and whenever you find this podcast episode, whether it's in the middle of the year, you can pick up values and start right where you're at. Number 2, start journaling. What were times in your life where you felt joy, where you felt lit up? I was just at an event. I just had a day the other day on Saturday where I did a tradition with my daughter that I always do with 2 of our friends. We've been doing it for 13 years. It lit me up, because it was one of my values for the holidays. I choose values during holiday times, and one of them is connection, and the other was spirit. That evening I was part of another event, and I went home energized, even though it was late at night and I was tired and my feet were swollen, it was cold outside. I had moved towards my values that day. The whole day was a day that was very much in line with my values. So if you're confused by this, you've printed off your list, you're not sure what your values are for the year, you're not even sure if you want to try this, give it a try. See if it feels more expansive. The problem with New Year's resolutions, I find, is that, 2 weeks into the new year, or by Valentine's Day in February, you've already fallen off the wagon. You've forgotten what your goals were, and you're lost in the weeds. The beautiful part this year was it didn't matter what quarter of the year I was in, I had my values written in my journal and in my calendar. And they were a reminder of, am I making choices in my calendar that move me towards my values? And then with all the opportunities we have to say yes and no to things, and there's another episode that I've shared my thoughts on that, It's easy to say yes at times. Is your yes moving towards your values? For example, I'm going to just randomly pull one off the list today. If your value for 2020 happens to be grace, and all of a sudden you find yourself in an interpersonal relationship situation, or maybe there's a situation where you're trying to work on a new skill, or you're supposed to in your mind be in a place in your life that you're not yet at. All your neighbors, all your friends, they've already graduated college, they've already gotten that promotion, they're already married, they already have kids, their house looks a certain way, their bodies look a certain way. Can you foster grace? If grace is your value, do you see where that's so much more expansive? Then you can make measurable steps and goals. You can say, for this month of March, I'm going to work on grace. But maybe you're working on some forgiveness. Maybe you need to write those letters for those unfinished conversations. And that fosters more grace in your life. Maybe grace for you is a more faith-based word. And for you, grace is going back to church. Maybe you haven't worshiped in your church community for a while. And grace is going to help you practice that in your life. I hope that these tips will help you. First and foremost, journaling about times in your life where, or days or experiences where you knew you were lit up, where you were congruent with your values. You were living in a way that felt in line. These are all buzzwords for values, I think. And then printing off a list and then just going through with no judgment. Just get curious. Just start circling as many words that speak to you. Start noticing words you hear, that you hear in a television show, that you see driving down the freeway on billboards, whatever. And then get your 10 down to a 5. And then sit with those 5. I really feel, a friend of mine I reached out to, I'm struggling in panic because it's almost the end of the year and I don't feel like I'm getting clear yet. New Year's isn't here yet and I really want to have these 2 words for the next year. She gave me some great advice. She said, don't panic, get curious. And curious is a really great word because, and it's actually on one of my lists. It's on this list. Curious, being curious about life allows you to kind of let go of that grip that we sometimes have, that control that we want things to look a certain way. And when we get curious about ourselves, about our relationships, about our health, about our professional careers, whatever that is, when we get curious, that's where creativity can come in. That's where faith can come in. That's where grace can come in. So get curious about your values. What is speaking to your heart? Sit with those 5 words for a week or so and then try to narrow it down to 2. I have a faith practice of prayer, and I think prayer is a really helpful way in deciding your values. And then write your values, put them places. Make actionable, smaller steps and goals that are just for this month. I'm going to pick another word, unity. I'm going to work on unity. What does unity and connection look like for you? Maybe unity in your home is working on this month as a family. We're going to have family dinner 3 days a week. And I'm going to work on unity that way. Maybe unity within your community, your church community, your school community. So those are just some examples. I hope here at the ReConnect podcast, we start the conversations, and we love to hear from our listeners when they say, you talked about this subject that was uncomfortable, or you brought up this idea and this is how I'm practicing it in my life. I believe in the idea of practice. We're not perfect. We're not arriving at some destination. At the end of the next year, what do you want to feel as you sit there on New Year's Eve? Can you look back? It makes me emotional thinking about it. I look back on this last year that we're just finishing up, and I'm overwhelmed with this awareness of gratitude that I haven't been perfect. I've practiced and I've fallen down a lot. I haven't been perfect as a mom, as a wife, as a sister, as a friend, as a speaker, as an author, as a media contributor, but I've practiced more influence, and I've tried to go into the direction of faith instead of fear. Those values have served me this year. And I can say that I didn't reach every goal I set, even the small measurable ones, on a weekly or monthly basis, but I've fostered and practiced these values. And that feels more hopeful. And when we feel more hopeful, we actually move towards our values more. When we go to shame, we actually move away from our values. And that, to me, is the real key. And the reason why I appreciate versus New Year's resolutions, which can be shame-inducing, and I would rather work on values, which are more hopeful, and they allow you to practice. Maybe you're not being consistent. Maybe you need to look at your goals and see what you're doing to sabotage when you start to make some smaller goals that help you foster these values. And that too can be an area. Consistency is one of those value words that you could practice this year. And see how open that is. You could be consistent about lots of things throughout the year instead of just one area. So I hope this is encouraging to you. I hope you'll share this. As you start to see commercials for all these weight loss exercise programs or goals, making more money, going back to school, I hope you won't get too into comparisons, but that you get really centered, reconnect with you, with your spirit. Think and ponder on times in your life where you knew you were living in line with your values. How did that feel? Did you feel more joy? Did you feel more successful? Did you feel more healthy? Whatever that looks like for you. I believe that as we all elevate and give permission to each other to bring our unique contributions to the world, which means your values are going to look different than your spouses, your kids, your neighbors, your best friends, your mom, your sister, your brother, that as we all connect to ourselves, reconnect to those around us, then we bring our best self to the world. And I love being around people that are living their unique contribution, that they're living their value system. Another thing that I think is important is that my values and your values do not have to match. I love when I meet people that think very differently than I do, that vote very differently than I do, that worship differently than I do, that grew up differently than I did. Because when they are showing up in their unique space and they're living their values, it inspires me to live mine. My friends that are of different faith, of different walks of life, they know that I respect their value system and they respect mine. And there's something about that in the world right now that I think is disheartening. We're not protecting that in each other. We're using social media to fight. We're using social media to throw down words and ridicule and insult one another, instead of just saying, hey, I value something different than you do. You really value the environment. That's really important to you. I can respect that. I value this. And so let's make space not only to creating your own value direction for this new year, but also give the people around you permission. Invite them to print off a list of values and start to make their top 10, then their top 5, and their 2. And then remember that if you fall off the wagon, so to speak, and you've completely forgotten by the summertime what your values are, you can always return to it. Return to connection, reconnect to those values, and use them as compasses in your life instead of a black and white either or, yes or no, success, fail. There's so much of our lives that is ambiguous, paradoxical, that is not easily tied up in a bow and put in a box. Most of us are living very complex, very layered, very messy lives. And so that's the other reason I love values, is that they allow for space. There's room for a lot when we think of values instead of just these very, very specific goals and New Year's resolutions. So I hope this message helps inspire you as you go forward in this new year. And thank you again for joining us here at the ReConnect podcast. Thank you, Anasazi Foundation, for making sure this podcast happens, and for the Sturry Studios for this year of visiting this studio. I'm so grateful. Share the good out in your world in whatever way this new year brings. And thank you again for joining here at the ReConnect podcast. I'm Ganel-Lyn Condie.
Thank you for listening to the ReConnect podcast, presented by Anasazi Foundation. Are you worried about your teenager? Are they struggling with depression, low self-esteem, anger, drugs, or suicidal thoughts and feelings? If so, Anasazi Foundation can help. Anasazi is a wilderness therapy program for at-risk youth, and our mission is to help turn hearts homeward. To learn more about us, please visit anasazi.org. If you liked this show, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Thank you again.